Alright, so here we go. Just ending World War II. Great Britain's still in control of most of the world. Um, United States is helping Japan rebuild. And the last piece is how to divide up the spoils of war. Most countries went back to where they were. The Soviet Union and the Western world, France, Great Britain, and the United States were trying to decide what to do with Europe, mostly Germany. But that is a story for another time. The biggest problem comes with what to do with the Middle East. At the end of World War II, many Jews fled the Nazis back to the promised land of Zion, which we now call Palestine at that time. Britain had a difficult time keeping the peace. There was a huge flood of refugees moving down into that area, into the blue area on the maps here. And you can see in the last one is how it was finally divided up in those last two. Is the red area was proposed Palestinian state or a Muslim state, and it was and still is today, I wouldn't say hotly contested, but still debated over exactly where the boundaries are between Palestine and Israel. Notice that most of everybody wanted a piece of Jerusalem or all of Jerusalem, and it is, depending on who you are, it's still a bone of contention. But that we'll deal with more of that in the near future. Also, at the end of World War II, China goes back to the way it was before the war. For the Allies and for Japan, the Japanese surrender in 1945 signaled peace. For China, it just got back to where they were before Japan started to take over their country. And that was the civil war between Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang or the KMT, and Mao Zedong's Chinese Communist Party or the CCP. Chiang Kai-shek viewed the society was best served by a military leadership. Chiang Kai-shek tried to enforce this. Very similar to Hitler and Mussolini, is almost a dictatorish type. Mao Zedong, the Chinese Communist Party, would be more of governmental rule, not military rule, with a few in power, not just a single leader in terms of the way Chiang Kai-shek was viewing it. The United States and the Soviet Union were allies against Japan and Germany. They couldn't decide how to split up Germany, so they split Western Europe and East and West Berlin in half, and one was more Soviet or communist, and the other was more Western European or American style. The U.S. supported Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist Chinese government. The Soviet Union supported Mao and the Communist Party, giving them weapons, ammunition, and military support, but not actually fighting their war for them. Eventually, Mao defeats Chiang. The Nationalist Party became corrupt, as all dictatorships do at some point. The leadership was divided and they kind of fell apart. The Red Army, the poor peasants, had nothing to lose and all to gain, so they were able to withstand the barrage from Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist Chinese government and become victorious over Chiang Kai-shek. The Red Army takes over. They enter Beijing, the capital city of China, and begin to establish a Communist Party control over China. So that took about 4 years-ish. So the Communists win. Chiang Kai-shek, the Kuomintang, the leadership, everybody who supported them were forced to leave to Formosa, which is currently now known as Taiwan, and they set up the Republic of China, which is different than the People's Republic of China, which is communist. Mao Zedong becomes the absolute dictator of China as the secretary of the Communist Party. And now we have literally two Chinas since 1949. This two-China problem is not a problem to the rest of the world, but to the people of China, it's major stark differences. I guess one way you could think of it is the stark differences between the liberals and conservatives, or the staunch Republicans and Democrats of the United States. Very difficult to get along with each other, and there's other issues along there. And we'll take a look at a quick clip.
In the cities, people's lives had not improved after the war. Massive economic problems were undercutting Jiang's support. The government's financial policies were chaotic. The homeless and starving filled city streets. Black market trading and corruption were widespread. To make matters worse, in 1947, floods in the south destroyed the rice crop. And in the north, there was a devastating famine. In response, the United Nations Relief Agency sent millions of dollars in aid. America continued to send vast quantities of war surplus and millions more dollars to help Jiang in his struggle against the communists. Many were certain that Jiang's family was embezzling huge amounts of this aid. He and his wife continued to ask for more. In 1947, President Truman sent Albert Wedemeyer back to China to assess the situation. Although it was clear that Jiang's government was corrupt and losing support, for America there was no alternative. Wedemeyer urged Jiang to effect immediate, drastic political and economic reforms. At the same time, he recommended more U.S. aid. But American aid could not win the war for Jiang. He made the crucial mistake of overextending his forces in the north. The communists responded with a change in tactics. They mounted a major offensive against the nationalist armies in the cities. The change of tactics worked. By November 1948, after only a month and a half, the communists won control of North China. With North China under communist control, the battle for central China began.
The nationalists failed because we completely lost the people's support. I had heard that during the Northern Expedition, the people gave us flowers and food. During the war against Japan, the people provided intelligence and helped us resist the Japanese. Once the Civil War started, we couldn't find anyone to give us even road directions. There's a saying in China, the water that carries the boat can also overturn it.
On January 21st, 1949, 11 days after the battle for central China, Chiang Kai-shek resigned. In Shanghai, people were leaving in droves. Chiang Kai-shek and his government retreated to the island of Taiwan. It was carefully planned. They took a huge part of China's art treasures and all of the central bank reserves. U.S. aid followed. The war continued without Chiang Kai-shek. The communists prepared to cross the Yangtze River, heading for Nanking and Shanghai. They quickly overcame nationalist defenses. With the communists just outside Shanghai, the the remaining nationalist police stepped up their anti-communist activities.
On October 1st, 1949, we listened to the radio. We heard the ceremony of the founding of the People's Republic of China. Chairman Mao proclaimed that the Chinese people had stood up. All of us were overjoyed. We jumped around. We were really proud and happy.
Also, after World War II, it had a major impact on the effect of Africa. A lot of the important battles were fought in North Africa. Many of the Africans who were in those colonies, just like the Indians who fought for Great Britain in World War I, they were recruited to fight for the Allies using the same type of idea. You need to help us against the evils of fascism and Nazism. You know, you don't want to be controlled by them. If they defeat us, you'll be under their control, and we're much better than they are. At the end of the war, anybody who has been told that would kind of went, well, why should I give my life for you to be free when I'm not even free in my own country? The ordinary African, most of them, life was absolutely no different than it would have been under fascism or Nazism. Control is control regardless of what you call it. And that's kind of how they felt, and they developed this sense of tie to their home country, not to the controlling country. And as these veterans return, and they return more and more and more and more, some of the Western leaders of the world composed a document called the Atlantic Charter, which directed the Allies' war effort and how they were going to go through the war. And the third paragraph of this was respect the rights of people who to choose the form of government under which they will live. That was more directed towards Germany. If we defeat Germany and liberate a lot of these countries that were under this fascist and Nazist idea, is that the people would choose, not the dictators or the rulers would be able to choose that. But many of the Africans kind of went, well, wait a minute. We fought in the war as well, and the self-government should be restored to us because we were part of those allies, and this should at least end Great Britain's colonial rule in Africa. So the whole wording becomes an issue that it wasn't meant that way, but it can be implied that way. So that gives them a little bit more power and authority to move forward with this independence movement in Africa. So great changes were starting to take place all over the world. This more independence and isolated, or not isolated countries, but the countries becoming more independent and working collaboratively together, not just trying to take over things, becoming more interdependent rather than independently owning other countries. European colonies in Asia demanded and earned independence from Europe. Particular importance was this India gaining independence. We already looked at Gandhi's role in that in 1947, 2 years immediately after World War II. China gets its land back from Japan immediately after the war. So many Africans looked at India and China as, well, if they get it, why can't we earn our own independence as well? This should be a case for us. So looking at the end of the World War II and the colonial control in Africa, you can still see not much has changed from 1914. There's been a little bit of movement here and there, a little bit of governmental change, but nothing that we need to be really highly concerned or focused on. By the 1940s and early 1950s, new mass-based political parties formed. So the African people began to form their own political parties, and they were not restricted to an education or level of education. It's mostly a mass support of how many people can we get to join our side, and if we get a big enough voice, maybe they will give us our independence. It became more of a demand and an opportunity to end the discrimination for the blacks in Africa. And for the most part, this African nationalist idea took the European powers by surprise. They reluctantly responded to these massive demands for independence. After the war, there was huge war debt, and most of the colonizing countries, the Italians, the Britons, the French, the Belgians, Germany had already lost theirs foothold in what was Africa after World War I. They just didn't have the money, the resources, the manpower to fight another war, to keep, as we might say, the savages at bay. So a lot of it just became asking for independence and eventually receiving it. By 1951, Libya and Egypt were the first ones to gain their independence. So right around 5 to 7 years after the World War II, countries just started to fall out of colonial power and into independence. Gold Coast was next in 57. They were the first country south of the Sahara Desert to become independent. 1960 was a huge year. 14 countries gained their independence in 1960. By 1966, all but 6 of them were independent states. So just over 20 years, there was no... While the movement to our independence was quick, it did not occur without struggle. There were some struggle, but it wasn't violent struggle. It was a lot of rallies and negotiations and building that political power with the Africans. By 1966, like I said, it was mostly nonviolent. The other 6, that's a different story. By the end of the 1960s, 6 of them remained. 6 of the 5 were the settler colonies. We talked about those settler colonies a while ago, especially with the Boers. The Boers, even with their fight with Great Britain, which started the scramble for Africa, they were mostly in southern Africa. Those of Angola, Mozambique, Namibia, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. Notice that we've got Portugal, South African, which was the Belgians. South Africa was Belgium, and Zimbabwe was Belgium/British. In those small Portuguese colonies of Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde in the west was the 6th colony. There'll be little fanfare with those, but we'll focus on mostly the ones in southern Africa. So here's a map, and I want to point out in southern Africa when they finally earned their independence, notice that they were well after 1960. 1966, 1980, 1975, 1994, 1990, 1975, 1966, 68. So you see that there's something going on here, and we've got to look at a little bit closer of what that's going to. Notice this is what Great Britain was like before World War I and World War II. And then after World War II, they literally lost the hold. Their octopus tentacles were retracted. So what was happening with these African countries? For many years, the European settlers in these colonies had the right to vote. They used the vote to elect representatives who then passed laws to protect the power of the European-born or the European background settlers, in other words, the whites, and discriminated highly against the Africans, the black people. They believed that if voting was the right of all citizens, the majority of the population would use their vote to bring independence to African rule. So those African nationalists knew that the blacks outnumbered the whites, and they could use the power of the vote to turn the tides, if you will. But on the same side, the whites also knew that as well. And they responded to these constitutional demands of the African Nationalist Party and banning all political protests with violence. There was repressive legislation only allowing the settler governments to arrest and imprison the leaders of the banned African parties. It allowed them to do lots and lots of different things that favored the whites for them to stay in power. Some of you may be saying, oh, that seems vaguely familiar, and it was. It's very similar to many of the laws that we passed after the Civil War that led to the Civil Rights Movement. Separate but equal, Plessy versus Ferguson. A lot of those major court cases we settled in the courts, but we also settled on the streets with protests and people like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Moving forward. And you can even see this in the Emmett Till. Emmett Till, there were things you could do if you were white and you wasn't going to anything was going to happen to you, and there were things that if you did and you were black, which seemed very petty or very minor, could get you into a lot of trouble.